The 911 call crackled through dispatch at 1:15 p.m. on June 18, 2002, and what the caller described would make seasoned officers physically sick. A man who regularly swam at the Foxborough Apartments pool in Leawood, Kansas, had arrived for his afternoon laps and found a scene straight from a nightmare. Blood pooled across the concrete deck, equipment scattered everywhere, and there, barely clinging to life, lay 19-year-old Ali Kemp, her body broken, her face unrecognizable from the savage beating she'd endured. But here's what makes this case absolutely bone-chilling. Ali had fought back with everything she had, scratching and clawing at her attacker, unknowingly trapping his DNA under her fingernails. That tiny biological signature would become the key to solving her murder. The problem? Nobody had any idea who it belonged to, and it would take 5 agonizing years before technology and chance would finally unmask the monster who did this. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the damage was already catastrophic. Ali had been struck repeatedly with a blunt object, the attack so vicious that investigators would later describe it as one of the most brutal assaults they'd ever witnessed. She was still breathing, barely, when paramedics loaded her into the ambulance. But the question screaming through everyone's mind was simple and terrifying. Who could do something like this to a young woman working her summer job? But then, before we understand the horror of what happened that Tuesday afternoon, you need to know who Ali Kemp really was. Because this wasn't just another statistic, another cold case file gathering dust. This was a vibrant, beloved daughter whose life had barely begun. Before we dive into this story, do me one small favor. Hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do. Ali Elizabeth Kemp grew up in the comfortable suburbs of Leawood, Kansas, where neighbors knew each other's names and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. Born on September 1st, 1982, Ali was the kind of person who lit up every room she walked into. Her parents, Roger and Kathy Kemp, raised her alongside her siblings in a tight-knit family that prioritized kindness, hard work, and looking out for others. Ali wasn't just pretty, though friends would tell you she absolutely was. She possessed something deeper, a genuine warmth that made people feel seen and valued. Throughout high school, Ali threw herself into everything. She played soccer with the same fierce determination she brought to her studies. She laughed easily, made friends effortlessly, and dreamed big dreams about her future. By the time she graduated, Ali had her sights set on Kansas State University, where she'd enrolled as a freshman. The plan was simple: work hard during the school year, come home for summers, save money with a part-time job, and spend time with family before heading back to campus in the fall. That summer job, pool attendant at the Foxborough Apartments, it seemed perfect. The pay was decent, the hours were flexible, and the work wasn't particularly demanding. Ali would open the pool area in the mornings, keep things clean and organized, check people in, enforce basic rules, and close up in the evenings. Most days were quiet, filled with mothers bringing their kids for afternoon swims or residents stopping by for a quick workout in the pool. Ali approached the job with the same enthusiasm she brought to everything else, showing up on time, being friendly to everyone, taking pride in keeping the area spotless. On the morning of June 18, 2002, Ali woke up in her childhood bedroom like she had hundreds of times before. She went through her normal routine, ate breakfast with her family, and kissed her mom goodbye before heading out the door. Kathy Kemp would later say that moment haunted her. The casualness of it, the assumption that, of course, there would be a tomorrow and another day after that. How could she have known it was the last time she'd ever see her daughter alive? Ali arrived at the Foxborough Apartments around 10 a.m., unlocking the pool area and beginning her opening duties. The weather was typical for Kansas in June: hot, humid, the kind of heat that made the pool especially attractive. She set out chairs, checked chemical levels, turned on the radio to her favorite station. Everything was routine, everything was normal. But then, sometime between 11:30 a.m. and 1 p.m., everything went catastrophically wrong. Here's where the timeline gets murky, and that murkiness would plague investigators for years. The pool area sat somewhat isolated from the main apartment buildings, visible if someone happened to be looking, but not constantly monitored. No security cameras covered that section of the property. No witnesses saw anyone approaching. The radio Ali had been playing continued its broadcast, pop songs drifting across the empty deck. And somewhere in that 90-minute window, a predator struck. The attack was staggering in its brutality. Ali's assailant used a blunt object. Investigators believe it may have been a tool or piece of equipment from the pool area itself to strike her repeatedly about the head and face. But Ali didn't go down without a fight. Physical evidence showed she'd fought back ferociously, using every ounce of strength to defend herself. She scratched at her attacker, leaving deep gouges. She struggled against him with such force that the scene showed signs of a prolonged, desperate battle. But then the attacker fled, leaving Ali bleeding and unconscious on the concrete. When the regular pool visitor arrived at 1:15 p.m. for his scheduled swim, he walked into every emergency responder's worst nightmare. He immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he tried to describe what he was seeing. By the time paramedics arrived, Ali's injuries were so severe that her chances of survival looked grim. They rushed her to Overland Park Regional Medical Center, where doctors and nurses fought desperately to save her life. But the damage was too extensive. Ali Kemp died from her injuries, never regaining consciousness. She was 19 years old. The news hit Leawood like a physical blow. This was supposed to be a safe community, a place where violent crime felt like something that happened somewhere else to someone else. Parents hugged their children tighter that night. Women who worked alone suddenly felt vulnerable in ways they never had before. And the question everyone kept asking was the same one that would drive the investigation for the next 5 years. Who did this and why? Leawood Police Department launched the biggest investigation in the city's history. Detectives worked around the clock, chasing down every lead, interviewing hundreds of people, building a timeline of Ali's last hours. They looked at everyone, every ex-boyfriend, every acquaintance, every maintenance worker who had access to the property, every resident of the apartment complex. Tips poured in from concerned citizens who'd seen something, heard something, or just had a hunch about someone who seemed off. But then came the first major break, and the first major frustration. Medical examiners collected DNA evidence from under Ali's fingernails. The scratches she'd inflicted on her attacker had captured biological material, actual cells from his skin. This was gold for investigators, the kind of evidence that could definitively identify a killer. They immediately ran it through CODIS, the national DNA database that law enforcement agencies use to match evidence from crime scenes with known offenders. Nothing, no match. The DNA belonged to someone who'd never been arrested before, never had their genetic profile entered into any system. The devastation of that dead end can't be overstated. Here was proof, scientific, indisputable proof, of who killed Ali Kemp. But without a name to attach to that DNA sequence, it might as well have been invisible ink. Investigators created a composite sketch based on witness descriptions of suspicious individuals seen near the pool area around the time of the attack. They released it to the media, plastering it across local news broadcasts and newspapers. Someone out there had to recognize this person. Someone had to know something. But then, as weeks turned into months, the leads dried up. Every promising tip led nowhere. Every suspect was cleared. The composite sketch generated calls, but none panned out. Detectives found themselves stuck in the worst position an investigator can face. They knew Ali's killer had left his calling card at the scene, but they couldn't identify him. Roger and Kathy Kemp refused to accept that their daughter's murder would become just another cold case statistic. The grief of losing Ali was unbearable, the kind of pain that destroys families and ruins lives. But then, instead of letting that grief consume them, they made a choice. They would honor Ali's memory by making sure what happened to her led to something meaningful. In 2003, the Kemps founded the Ali Kemp Educational Foundation with a specific mission, teaching young women self-defense and awareness skills that could save their lives. The centerpiece was the SAVE program, Stop Abusive and Violent Environments, which offered free training to women of all ages. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ali had fought back, had done everything right in that moment of terror, and her resistance had ultimately provided the evidence that would one day catch her killer. Now her parents were teaching other women to fight back too. The foundation grew rapidly, training thousands of women across Kansas and beyond. Roger Kemp became a tireless advocate, giving speeches, organizing events, keeping Ali's name in the public consciousness. He also kept constant pressure on law enforcement, not in an antagonistic way, but as a reminder that someone out there knew something and they couldn't give up. But then, as 2003 became 2004, and 2004 became 2005, the case seemed destined to remain unsolved. Detectives never closed the file. They continued running down leads, re-interviewing witnesses, hoping for that one break that would crack everything open. But hope was fading. What nobody knew was that 1,400 miles away in Hartford, Connecticut, Ali's killer was living an almost normal life. If you're watching this and thinking about how many cold cases could be solved with the right break, you're not alone in that frustration. This channel covers cases like Ali's, stories where justice seemed impossible until one crucial piece fell into place. Hit that subscribe button right now, because we dive deep into true crime cases that prove giving up is never an option, and you won't want to miss what happens next in this story. Benjamin Appleby was 23 years old when he murdered Ali Kemp. At that moment, he was working as a swimming pool installer in the Kansas City metropolitan area, a job that had him traveling to different apartment complexes and residential properties to maintain and repair pool equipment. Investigators would later confirm that Appleby had worked in the Leawood area that summer and had likely encountered the Foxborough Apartments and Ali during one of those service calls. But then, here's where the psychological question becomes impossible to ignore. Why? What drives a person to commit such an act of savage violence against someone they don't even know? Benjamin Appleby wasn't some Hollywood villain with a dramatic backstory that explained his actions. He was, by most accounts, unremarkable. He had a job. He interacted with people normally. Nothing about him screamed dangerous predator to the people who knew him casually. But then, that's often the most disturbing truth about violent criminals. They don't announce themselves. They blend in. They seem normal right up until the moment they're not. Experts who later examined the case suggested that Appleby fit the profile of an opportunistic predator. He may have seen Ali working alone at the pool during one of his service calls. He may have observed her routine, noting that she was often by herself during certain hours. The isolated location of the pool area would have been obvious to anyone paying attention. A young woman, alone, in a space where screams might not be heard, where an attacker could strike and flee without being seen. The level of violence he used suggests rage, a need to dominate and destroy that goes beyond simply wanting to commit assault. Some criminal psychologists believe that offenders like Appleby harbor deep resentments and feelings of powerlessness in their regular lives, and they act out those frustrations on vulnerable victims who represent something they can control. But then, the clinical explanations only go so far in helping us understand the incomprehensible. How do you explain choosing to end someone's life, someone who'd never done anything to you, who was simply trying to earn money for college? How do you justify the conscious decision to pick up a weapon and use it to cave in the skull of a teenage girl? You can't. There is no justification. There is no explanation that makes it make sense. After murdering Ali, Appleby fled Kansas. He packed up his life and moved to Connecticut, putting 1,400 miles between himself and the crime scene. In Hartford, he started over. He got a job. He met a woman. He got married. His wife had no idea that the man she'd pledged her life to had brutally murdered someone in Kansas 3 years earlier. To everyone who knew him in Connecticut, Benjamin Appleby was just a regular guy living a regular life. But then, predators rarely stop at just one victim. In 2004, Appleby sexually assaulted a woman in Hartford. The attack led to his arrest, and as part of standard procedure, police collected his DNA and entered it into CODIS. Appleby was charged, prosecuted, and served time for that assault. But the significance of his DNA being entered into the database wouldn't become clear for another 3 years. Meanwhile, back in Kansas, Roger and Kathy Kemp continued their mission. The foundation they'd built in Ali's name had trained over 100,000 women by 2007. Roger still spoke to media outlets every year on the anniversary of Ali's death, still pushed investigators to keep looking, still believed that somehow, some way, they'd find the person responsible. But then came 2007, and everything changed. Somewhere in an office, a computer ran a routine comparison of DNA profiles in CODIS. This happens constantly. As new DNA evidence is entered from crime scenes, the system automatically checks it against every profile in the database. And as DNA from arrests is added, it's checked against every unsolved case waiting for a match. On that particular day, the computer flagged something. The DNA profile from Benjamin Appleby's 2004 Connecticut arrest matched the DNA found under Ali Kemp's fingernails in 2002. The odds of a coincidental match were astronomical, 99.9% certainty that Benjamin Appleby had been Ali's attacker. When detectives in Leawood got the call about the match, they couldn't believe it. After 5 years of dead ends and frustration, they finally had a name. But then came the obvious question: who the hell was Benjamin Appleby? And what was his connection to Ali? The investigation kicked into overdrive. Detectives pulled Appleby's work records and discovered he'd been employed as a pool installer in the Kansas City area during the summer of 2002. They found witnesses who remembered seeing him at various properties in Leawood. The timeline matched perfectly. Appleby had been in town during the exact window when Ali was murdered. The realization hit investigators like a freight train. This wasn't someone from Ali's social circle. This wasn't a jealous ex or a spurned acquaintance. This was a predator who'd seen a vulnerable target and acted on it. Ali never knew Benjamin Appleby. She'd never spoken to him, never had any interaction with him beyond possibly seeing him in passing if he'd done work at the Foxborough pool. She died because she happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And a monster happened to notice her. The arrest came swiftly. Connecticut authorities took Appleby into custody on murder charges, and the extradition process began. His wife was reportedly shocked and devastated, unable to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the brutal killer described in the charges. But then Appleby did something that would infuriate many people following the case. He denied everything. Even faced with DNA evidence that was virtually irrefutable, he claimed innocence. He suggested the DNA must have gotten there some other way, that there must be some mistake, that he'd never even been to that pool. For those of you watching who followed other DNA cold cases and want to see how modern forensics are finally bringing justice to families who've waited decades, this is exactly why this channel exists. We cover the stories that prove science and determination can overcome even the most careful criminals. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we're about to get into how investigators broke down Appleby's lies piece by piece. The evidence against Benjamin Appleby was overwhelming. Beyond the DNA match, investigators had placed him in Leawood during the time frame of the murder. They had witness statements from people who'd seen him working in the area. They had his complete lack of alibi for the day of June 18th, 2002. Most damningly, they had the DNA evidence itself. Microscopic proof that he'd had physical contact with Ali during her final moments. But then, as the case moved toward trial, something shifted. Appleby's defense attorneys had to know they couldn't win. The DNA evidence alone would convince any jury, and the circumstantial evidence supporting it only made the case stronger. Fighting this in court would result in a conviction, and given the brutality of the crime, prosecutors were seeking the death penalty. In 2009, after 2 years of legal maneuvering, Benjamin Appleby finally admitted what everyone already knew: he'd killed Ali Kemp. His confession came as part of a plea agreement that would spare him from execution. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and aggravated kidnapping. But then, even in his confession, Appleby tried to minimize what he'd done. He claimed he hadn't intended to kill Ali, that things had gotten out of control. Prosecutors weren't buying it. The forensic evidence showed a sustained, brutal attack. This wasn't a case of something spiraling out of control. This was calculated violence. The plea deal resulted in a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Benjamin Appleby would spend the rest of his life in a Kansas prison. He would never walk free. He would never have another chance to hurt anyone. For Roger and Kathy Kemp, the arrest and conviction brought a complicated mix of emotions. Justice had finally been served, but it couldn't bring Ali back. It couldn't erase 7 years of grief and unanswered questions. The trial they'd been prepared to sit through, as painful as it would have been, was avoided by the plea deal, which meant some questions would never be fully answered. During Appleby's sentencing hearing, the Kemps delivered victim impact statements that left the courtroom in tears. Roger spoke about the daughter they'd lost, the grandchildren they'd never have, the future that had been stolen. But then he also spoke about strength, about the foundation they'd built in Ali's name, about refusing to let evil win. Kathy Kemp looked directly at Benjamin Appleby and told him that while he'd taken their daughter, he hadn't broken their family. He hadn't destroyed them. Instead, they'd turned their grief into something meaningful, something that was saving lives. The courtroom was packed with Ali's friends, former classmates, and community members who'd never forgotten her. Many wore purple, Ali's favorite color, in her honor. The judge, in pronouncing sentence, noted the severity of the crime and the devastating impact it had on not just the Kemp family, but the entire community. Benjamin Appleby showed little emotion during the proceedings. He offered no real apology, no explanation that brought any clarity to his actions. He was led away in handcuffs to begin serving his life sentence, and that was the last time the Kemps had to look at the man who murdered their daughter. But then, as so often happens in true crime cases, the conviction raised as many questions as it answered. Had Benjamin Appleby attacked other women? His 2004 Connecticut assault proved he was willing to commit violent sexual crimes. Was Ali his first victim, or had there been others? Investigators looked into unsolved attacks in areas where Appleby had lived and worked, but no definitive connections were ever established. What made him target Ali specifically? Was it truly random? Or had he been watching her? Did he plan the attack in advance, or was it a spur-of-the-moment decision when he saw an opportunity? These questions would likely never be fully answered, because Appleby himself wasn't talking beyond his minimal guilty plea. And perhaps most haunting, if Appleby hadn't been arrested for the Connecticut assault, if his DNA hadn't been entered into CODIS, would he ever have been caught? Or would Ali's murder have remained unsolved indefinitely, with Roger and Kathy Kemp never knowing what happened to their daughter? The case highlights both the power and the limitations of forensic technology. DNA evidence is incredibly powerful when you have a suspect to compare it to. But without that comparison profile, even the most pristine DNA sample in the world can't tell you who it belongs to. Ali's case was solved because Benjamin Appleby committed another crime and got caught. Without that stroke of fortune, if fortune is even the right word, the DNA evidence might have sat in a database forever, waiting for a match that never came. This is why advocates push for expanding DNA databases, for collecting samples from more arrestees, for funding the processing of rape kits and evidence from cold cases. Every profile added to the system is another chance for an old case to finally get solved, another opportunity for a family to get answers. The Ali Kemp Educational Foundation continued its work, strengthened rather than diminished by the resolution of Ali's case. The SAVE program expanded, reaching more women, teaching more self-defense classes, spreading awareness about personal safety. Roger and Kathy Kemp became national advocates for victims' rights and cold case investigations. In the years since Appleby's conviction, the foundation has trained over 100,000 women in self-defense techniques. Instructors teach the same fierce resistance that Ali showed, the fighting spirit that ultimately led to her killer's capture. Multiple women have credited the training with helping them escape dangerous situations, with giving them the tools and confidence to fight back when threatened. The foundation also advocates for DNA database expansion and proper processing of forensic evidence. Roger Kemp has testified before legislative bodies about the importance of funding crime labs and maintaining DNA databases. Ali's case proves that these resources save lives and solve crimes, but only if they're properly supported. But then, beyond the statistics and the policy advocacy, the Foundation serves another crucial purpose. It keeps Ali's memory alive. Not as a victim, not as a statistic, but as the vibrant, loving person she was before Benjamin Appleby decided to take that away. If you've made it this far in Ali's story, and you're thinking about the other families still waiting for answers in their own cold cases, you understand why this content matters. Every case we cover on this channel could be the one that jogs someone's memory or inspires a detective to take another look at old evidence. Subscribe now if you believe these stories deserve to be told, because there are dozens more cases like Ali's where justice took years but finally arrived. The ripple effects of Ali's murder extended far beyond her immediate family. The Leawood community was forever changed by what happened at that pool on June 18, 2002. Security measures were upgraded at apartment complexes across the region. More properties installed cameras and improved lighting. The casual assumption that violence couldn't happen in nice suburban areas evaporated. But then, those changes came at the cost of innocence, of the comfortable belief that simply living in a safe neighborhood meant you were actually safe. Ali's case proved that predators don't respect zip codes or property values. They go where they find opportunity. For young women working summer jobs, the case served as a grim reminder to stay alert, to trust instincts, to understand that danger can appear in unexpected places. Many pool facilities changed their policies after Ali's murder, ensuring that attendants never worked alone, that panic buttons were installed, that check-in procedures were implemented. These practical changes saved lives, but they also represented a loss. The loss of the kind of carefree summer job that Ali had, where the biggest worry was whether the pool chemicals were balanced correctly. Benjamin Appleby remains in prison today, serving his life sentence at a Kansas correctional facility. He's eligible for parole in 2059, when he'll be in his 80s, effectively a life sentence given his age. Victims' rights advocates plan to oppose any parole attempt, ensuring that he never walks free. For Roger and Kathy Kemp, life has moved forward in the way it must after devastating loss. They've built a legacy in Ali's name that has touched hundreds of thousands of lives. They've become grandfather and grandmother to Ali's nieces and nephews, finding joy where they can while carrying the permanent weight of their daughter's absence. In interviews over the years, both have spoken about the strange duality of their experience. The grief never fully goes away. How could it? But alongside that grief exists pride in what the Foundation has accomplished, satisfaction in knowing that Ali's death led to something meaningful, and relief that they finally have answers about what happened and who was responsible. The case also stands as a testament to the value of persistence. If Roger Kemp had accepted that the case would never be solved, if he'd stopped pushing law enforcement to keep looking, if he'd given up hope, the outcome might have been different. His advocacy kept Ali's case active, kept it in investigators' minds, ensured that when that DNA match finally came through, detectives were ready to move immediately. But then, we have to acknowledge the element of chance that played a role. If Benjamin Appleby hadn't committed that assault in Connecticut, if he'd moved to a different state, if he'd managed to avoid arrest, would the case have been solved? Would there ever have been a DNA match? The uncomfortable answer is probably not. That reality underscores the importance of expanding forensic capabilities and DNA databases. How many unsolved cases are sitting in evidence rooms right now, with DNA samples that could identify the perpetrator if only that person's profile was in the system. How many families are still waiting for the lucky break that solved Ali's case? The technology exists. The science works. What's often lacking is funding, resources, and prioritization. Cold cases get pushed aside for active investigations. Evidence sits unprocessed because crime labs are backlogged. DNA databases remain incomplete because collection laws vary by state, and many profiles are never entered. Ali's story proves that solving these cases is possible. Her fierce resistance gave investigators the evidence they needed. Her parents' persistence kept the case alive. And ultimately, the DNA database system worked exactly as it should, connecting evidence from an old crime to a new offender. Since Appleby's conviction, dozens of other cold cases have been solved through similar DNA matches. Improved technology has made it possible to extract usable profiles from smaller samples, from degraded evidence, from cases that were once thought unsolvable. Genetic genealogy, using DNA databases to identify suspects through family connections, has opened entirely new avenues for investigation. The landscape of cold case investigation has changed dramatically since 2002. The tools available to detectives today were science fiction back when Ali was murdered. And the tools being developed now will make even more cases solvable in the future. But technology alone isn't enough. Cases like Ali's get solved when multiple factors align. Good evidence collection at the scene, proper storage and processing of that evidence, adequate funding for crime labs, comprehensive DNA databases, persistent family advocacy, and dedicated investigators who refuse to give up. For anyone watching who has a loved one in an unsolved case, Ali's story offers genuine hope. Justice delayed isn't always justice denied. Cases that seem hopeless can break open years or even decades later. The evidence is sitting there, waiting for the right connection to be made. The Ali Kemp Educational Foundation continues to honor her memory by empowering women to protect themselves. The self-defense classes teach physical techniques, but they also teach something equally important: the mindset that you have the right to fight back, that you don't have to be a victim, that your life is worth defending with everything you have. Ali demonstrated that mindset in her final moments. She didn't give up. She fought with everything she had, even when the situation seemed hopeless. And that resistance, that refusal to surrender, gave investigators the evidence that would eventually bring her killer to justice. In a very real sense, Ali Kemp solved her own murder. The scratches she inflicted on Benjamin Appleby, the DNA she trapped under her fingernails, the physical evidence of her fierce resistance. That's what caught him. Without that evidence, he would have remained unidentified, free to potentially hurt others, and the Kemp family would have been left with unanswered questions forever. There's something profoundly powerful in that reality. Ali couldn't save herself in that moment, but she made sure her attacker didn't get away with what he'd done. Even in death, she fought back. Even in death, she achieved something. The legacy of Ali Kemp extends beyond her individual case. She represents every young person whose life was cut short by violence. She represents every family that refuses to accept that their loved one's murder will go unsolved. She represents the power of persistence, the value of forensic science, and the importance of never giving up hope. Today, when women learn self-defense through the SAVE program, they're carrying forward Ali's fighting spirit. When cold cases get solved through DNA evidence, they're benefiting from the same technology that finally identified Benjamin Appleby. When families advocate for their loved ones, They're following the example set by Roger and Kathy Kemp. The pool at Foxborough Apartments still exists, though the complex has changed ownership and undergone renovations over the years. There's no memorial marker at the site. The Kemps chose to focus their energy on the foundation rather than on memorializing the place where Ali died. Instead, her memory lives in the women who've learned to protect themselves, in the cold cases that have been solved, in the changes to safety protocols that have saved lives. Benjamin Appleby stole Ali's future, but he couldn't destroy her impact. He took her life, but he couldn't take her legacy. The foundation bearing her name has accomplished more good than he could ever do harm. The women who've escaped dangerous situations because of training they received through the SAVE program are alive because of Ali. That's not justice. Nothing can truly be just when a 19-year-old dies violently. But its meaning, its purpose. It's proof that even the worst acts of evil can be transformed into something that helps others. For true crime followers, Ali's case offers important lessons. It demonstrates why physical resistance can matter, even when the situation seems hopeless. It shows why proper evidence collection and storage is crucial. That DNA sample sat waiting for 5 years before it could be matched. It proves that DNA databases work when properly maintained and expanded. And it illustrates why family advocacy matters, why keeping cases in the public eye can make a difference. The case also serves as a reminder of an uncomfortable truth. Most violent crimes aren't committed by strangers who emerge from the shadows. But when they are, when a predator chooses a victim randomly, the investigation becomes exponentially more difficult. There's no relationship to trace, no motive to uncover, no connection between victim and offender that points investigators in the right direction. Ali never knew Benjamin Appleby. She never had a conversation with him, never rejected his advances, never did anything to draw his attention beyond simply existing in a place where he could see her. That randomness makes her murder even more tragic, and it makes her family's ability to find meaning in the aftermath even more remarkable. As of 2025, the Ali Kemp Educational Foundation continues its work, adapted to new threats and new technologies, but maintaining its core mission. The foundation offers online training resources, partners with schools and community organizations, and advocates for policy changes that protect women and support cold case investigations. Roger and Kathy Kemp, now in their 70s, remain actively involved, though they've brought in additional leadership to help manage the growing organization. In interviews, they speak about Ali in present tense sometimes. Not because they've forgotten she's gone, but because her presence remains so strong in their work and their lives. The story of Ali Kemp is ultimately about 3 things: a vibrant young life cut short, a family's refusal to let their daughter's death be meaningless, and the power of persistence combined with science to finally bring a killer to justice. It's a story that validates the work of cold case investigators, the importance of forensic technology, and the impact that determined family advocacy can have. For Benjamin Appleby, the story ends in prison, where he'll spend the rest of his life paying for the brutal murder he committed on a hot June afternoon in 2002. He took everything from Ali Kemp, but in the end, her fierce resistance and her family's determination ensured he didn't get away with it. The case remains one of the most significant cold case solutions in Kansas history. An example of how DNA technology can bridge the gap between crime and consequence, even when years have passed. It's a case that law enforcement agencies across the country study, use as training material, and point to when advocating for resources and database expansion. And it's a case that proves what Roger Kemp promised his daughter would happen. They found him. It took 5 years, but they found him. Justice was delayed, but it wasn't denied. Ali Kemp's killer is behind bars for life. And her legacy of protecting and empowering other women continues to grow. Do me one small favor and hit that subscribe button and smash the like. It helps this community grow and makes sure stories like this one aren't forgotten. This case took decades to crack, and trust me, you're not going to want to miss a single detail. Also, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how many people around the world care about justice just as much as I do.